I stood there watching my mother push my brother's wheelchair toward the edge of a cliff just a step away from death. She smiled without hesitation. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. They tried to kill my brother for a $5.6 million inheritance, and me, I could only stand there watching my family destroy everything I once believed in. What you're about to hear is not just betrayal. It's the death of a part of my soul. If you think this is just a typical family story, you're wrong. Don't forget to subscribe for more intense episodes from us. The evening was just like any other at the Shaw household. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of silverware, and the rich aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air. Samantha sat at the dinner table with her parents Victoria and Clyde and her older brother Jason. They were seated in their usual spots, the worn oak table a silent witness to years of family meals that had always felt warm and secure. Laughter echoed between bites, the kind of laughter that came so naturally in a family that appeared on the surface to have it all. Jason, the eldest, had always been the golden child. He was everything Samantha wasn't: charming, athletic, charismatic. He had a future that seemed bright, a string of accomplishments already behind him, and the world at his feet. But there was something about that night that felt different, though Samantha couldn't put her finger on it. The conversation seemed more strained than usual, the smiles a little more forced. But as always, she pushed it aside. It was just a phase, she thought. They had their disagreements, but they were family. Families always found a way back to each other. Clyde, her father, was a man of few words, but his presence commanded respect. He was a respected architect in their community, the kind of person who had helped build much of the town with his own hands. He wasn't warm like Victoria, but his silent strength was the backbone of their home. The way he held his fork, methodical and deliberate, exuded authority, yet there was always a calmness about him, as if nothing could ever shake him. Victoria, her mother, was the epitome of grace. She was involved in charity work, constantly helping others, the town's darling. Her beauty, her poise, and her grace were what people saw. But there was something about her, something underneath that beautiful exterior that Samantha had never quite understood. Sometimes it felt like Victoria wore a mask, one that hid emotions Samantha could never seem to reach. As they sat there that night, she noticed her mother's smile, though still charming, seemed less genuine. Samantha watched her, trying to catch the glint of emotion behind those perfect eyes, but found nothing. She looked back at Jason, whose face remained perfectly neutral. Was it just her, or was the atmosphere at the table growing colder? The next day the phone call came, the one that shattered everything. Samantha was in her room flipping through her phone when the call from the hospital came in. The calm, clipped voice on the other end barely registered with her. "I'm so sorry," the voice said. "Your father has passed away. A heart attack." For a few moments, the world seemed to stop. She didn't understand. Her father was strong, healthy. This wasn't supposed to happen. She couldn't even move. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating her. Her knees buckled and she dropped her phone. A coldness spread through her body like ice running through her veins. When she reached the hospital, her mind was still in a daze. The sterile white walls did nothing to ease her growing sense of dread. Her father, her rock, the man who had always been the silent protector, was gone. At the funeral, the air felt suffocating. Victoria's composure never faltered, her face perfect, her demeanor serene. But Samantha couldn't help but notice the stiffness in her movements, the way her eyes darted around, never quite landing on Samantha for too long. Jason, on the other hand, kept his distance. His usual charm was nowhere to be found, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. He stood beside their mother, the perfect son, in front of everyone, but his eyes never met Samantha's. It was as if she had become invisible to him. As she stood beside the casket, clutching her father's worn, leather-bound watch, something he had passed down to her on her 16th birthday, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't the overwhelming sadness of losing a parent that troubled her. It was something else. It was the strange, unsettling distance she felt from her mother and brother, the way they seemed almost unaffected, like they were playing a role. Were they really grieving, or was there something else happening under the surface? She tried to reach out to Victoria after the service, her mother's coldness an invisible wall between them. Samantha had always looked up to her, admired her elegance and the way she effortlessly commanded attention. But now, in the wake of her father's death, Samantha felt like a stranger to her. She reached out to touch her arm to say something comforting, but Victoria merely offered a tight smile, a smile that seemed rehearsed fake. "It's going to be okay," Samantha whispered, but Victoria didn't respond. Her eyes never left the crowd, the people they had to thank for attending. She was already moving forward, already on to the next thing. For a moment, Samantha felt a pang of hurt deep within her. Her mother was here, but she wasn't really here. Jason stood in the background, his arms folded, his face impassive. He didn't even glance at her as she walked past him. It was as though he had retreated into a shell, a wall too high for her to climb. That night, the world felt different. Samantha lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sounds of the house almost too loud. She could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the soft rustling of leaves outside the window. But it was the silence in the house that rattled her most. The silence between her and her family, the space that had suddenly grown between them, was unbearable. She couldn't shake the feeling that her family was slipping away, not just emotionally, but in ways she couldn't yet understand. Over the next few days, her suspicions grew. Samantha noticed how quickly her mother and Jason moved to discuss her father's estate. The house was filled with paperwork, legal documents, and phone calls she wasn't privy to. Whenever she asked about her father's will, they would change the subject, or worse, brush her off. The more she observed, the more the strange behavior of Victoria and Jason felt intentional. There were no tears, no heartfelt stories about her father. No one wanted to talk about him, not really. Samantha had always been the quieter one, the one who didn't make waves. She had learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to blend into the background. But as the days passed, she began to feel that something was very wrong. Her family, the people she had trusted most in the world, were hiding something from her. Her heart ached with the realization that the people she had loved her whole life were now strangers. They were her family, but they had become something else. Her mind raced, her stomach twisted. What was going on? What were they hiding? It was only a matter of time before Samantha decided she would get the answers she desperately needed. She had to find out the truth, whatever it was, because right now the silence was louder than any words. And it was a silence that Samantha couldn't bear to live with any longer. Samantha had always trusted her family. They were the people who had raised her, the ones who had comforted her after bad days and celebrated with her on good ones. But now, as she walked through the sprawling house that had once felt like a safe haven, everything seemed colder. The silence between her and her mother Victoria was palpable. And Jason, her older brother, the one she'd always looked up to, had become a ghost in her life, too absorbed in his own world to even offer a kind word. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that her suspicions were first ignited. Samantha had gone to the library, her usual refuge in times of uncertainty, to search for a distraction. As she passed through the hallways, she glanced at the family portraits on the walls, each photo a reminder of a time when they were all together. But as she walked past the study, something caught her eye. A file cabinet, which she could have sworn had been locked for years, was slightly ajar. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, Samantha pushed the door open a fraction further. It was a simple moment, yet it felt like an eternity. Inside the cabinet, amidst a stack of old papers, were several legal documents, ones she had never seen before. They were meticulously organized, each one marked with her father's name, some bearing an unfamiliar company's logo, others bearing the unmistakable signature of a lawyer. Her pulse quickened as she rifled through the papers, pulling out a few that seemed to stand out. A trust agreement, a detailed list of properties, and most telling of all, a will. But this wasn't the will that had been read at the funeral. This one was newer, signed just a few months before her father's sudden death. The words on the page hit her like a punch to the stomach. The will stated clearly that her father's wealth would be divided half to Victoria and the other half to Jason. But there was no mention of her. No mention of Samantha. Her hands trembled as she put the papers down. She didn't understand. Why wasn't she included? What was going on? Her father had always told her she would inherit part of the family wealth when the time came, but now it seemed that wasn't the case. What had changed? Why hadn't anyone mentioned this will? Why had her father left her out? Samantha's mind raced as she quickly left the study, clutching the papers to her chest. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen. But there was something else, something deeper gnawing at her. It wasn't just the omission in the will that troubled her. It was everything. Her mother's coldness, the strange behavior from Jason, the way they were rushing to handle her father's estate without even consulting her. The whole thing didn't sit right. That night, Samantha couldn't sleep. She kept going over the documents in her mind, replaying each word, each line. She needed answers, and she knew she wasn't going to find them sitting around the house waiting for her family to tell her the truth. She had to dig deeper. The next morning, she made a decision. She would speak to the family lawyer, someone who had worked with her father for years and had been the executor of his will. Maybe, just maybe, he could shed some light on what was happening. Samantha knew it was a risky move going behind her mother's back and digging deeper into the estate, but at this point she didn't feel like she had any other choice. She called the lawyer, a calm, older man named Richard Thompson, and asked for a meeting. When he agreed, she felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this. But the moment the door of his office opened, Samantha's heart sank. Richard wasn't alone. Her mother was sitting across from him, her back straight, her smile tight, as if she knew exactly what was happening. "Samantha," Victoria said, her voice smooth and controlled. "What brings you here?" Samantha tried to steady her nerves. I just had some questions about Dad's will." She began glancing at the lawyer, then back to her mother. "I've been going over the papers, and I realized there are some things that don't add up. I thought I was included." Richard cleared his throat, his eyes flickering nervously. Victoria shot him a look one Samantha couldn't quite place before turning back to her. "Samantha." "Darling, you've had a lot to process," Victoria said, her tone warm but laced with something colder beneath. "The inheritance is a complicated matter. We've made arrangements. Everything has been handled just as your father would have wanted." Samantha's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't know why, but something about her mother's words felt wrong. Her mother wasn't telling the full truth. The way she avoided looking Samantha in the eye, the forced calmness in her voice, it was all too practiced. I just don't understand," Samantha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "How is it that I'm not mentioned in the will? Why didn't anyone tell me about this before?" Victoria's smile faltered for a moment. Just for a split second, but it was enough for Samantha to see it. The truth was slipping. For the first time in a long time, her mother wasn't as perfect as she appeared. There was a crack in the facade. "Samantha, it's not the right time for this," Victoria said, standing up. "You need to focus on healing, not on these trivial matters. Your father is gone. We need to move on." The words stung, but it wasn't just the words that bothered Samantha. It was the way her mother spoke about her father's death. "We need to move on." There was no grief in her voice, no mourning. It was as if Victoria was already living in the future, already thinking about what came next. But for Samantha, it felt like she was still stuck in the past, trapped in the memory of her father's loss. She left Richard's office that day with more questions than answers. She didn't know what her mother was hiding, but she knew one thing for sure: Victoria and Jason were keeping secrets. They were playing a game, and Samantha had just become the pawn. That evening, Samantha sat alone in her room, her mind spinning. She kept coming back to the will. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe her father had planned to change things and never had the chance. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. Something was off. Something was very wrong. Her instincts were telling her that her mother and Jason weren't being honest with her. They were hiding something much bigger than just a will. Samantha could feel it in her gut. The coldness from her mother, the avoidance from Jason, the way the family was moving forward without her, all of it pointed to one thing: betrayal. And no matter what it took, Samantha was going to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the harshest of realities. As the days passed, the feeling of unease only grew. Samantha was walking down a path she couldn't turn back from, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was certain: she would not stop until she had answers. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease that Samantha couldn't shake. Every moment at home felt like an eerie echo of what was supposed to be a time of mourning. Victoria's icy demeanor hadn't softened, and Jason continued to shut her out as if she were a stranger. Samantha was living in a house filled with ghosts, her family more distant than ever, and the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing day. But it was one night, as she sat in the living room going over the legal papers again, trying to make sense of the mess her father's estate had become, that her eyes landed on something else, something she hadn't noticed before. Samantha had been sorting through her father's old desk, going through drawers she hadn't touched in years when she found it. a dusty, worn box tucked beneath a stack of forgotten paperwork. It was small, not much larger than a shoebox, and tied with a leather strap. She opened it slowly as if expecting the contents to be something precious, something that had been kept hidden for a reason. Inside, there were stacks of documents neatly arranged, each one with a date written at the top. Some were old, others more recent. Samantha's heart pounded as she rifled through the papers. Her hands froze when she found what she was looking for: her father's will. But this wasn't the will that had been read at the funeral. This one was different, newer, much newer. It was signed just 6 months before his death. The language was precise, the terms clear. The will clearly stated that Samantha was to inherit a significant portion of the family's estate, a large sum of money, a house, investments. Her father had planned for her to be taken care of just as he had promised all those years ago. But there was a catch. The will stipulated that Samantha could only access her inheritance once she had reached a certain age, something about a trust fund that would only be unlocked after she turned 30. Her fingers trembled as she read the clauses again and again, trying to make sense of it all. Why hadn't her mother or Jason mentioned this? If Samantha's father had gone to such lengths to ensure she would be provided for, why was she being left out in the cold now? Her blood ran cold as she flipped through the pages. There it was, in the fine print: the assets were to be handled by the family's lawyer, a man named Richard Thompson, who had overseen much of her father's financial dealings over the years. Samantha felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. Something was off and she knew it. If this document was real, why was she being kept in the dark? Why had she been excluded from the discussions surrounding her father's estate? Why wasn't she told about this new will at the funeral, or when Jason and Victoria started handling everything? She needed answers, and she knew where to start. The next morning, Samantha didn't waste any time. She made her way to the law office of Richard Thompson, a place she'd been familiar with for most of her life. Richard had been close to her father, a trusted confidant. He had handled the Shaw family's legal matters for years, and Samantha had always felt a sense of security knowing that he was the one managing her father's estate. But now she wasn't so sure. Now she was beginning to wonder just how much he was hiding. When she arrived at the office, she was greeted by a secretary who led her to Richard's office. The walls were lined with books, and the large wooden desk in the center of the room had an aura of authority to it. Richard was sitting behind the desk, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looking as calm and composed as ever. "Samantha," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Richard," Samantha replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't come here to talk about her father's death. She came here for answers. "I need to talk to you about my father's will." Richard raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid everything has already been settled, Samantha. Your mother and Jason have been very clear about how they wish to handle things." "I'm sure they have," Samantha said, her voice tight. "But there's something I need to understand. I found a copy of my father's will, and it says that I'm entitled to a portion of his estate. Why wasn't I informed about this? Why was I left out of the discussions?" Richard's eyes flickered with something uncertainty, maybe guilt, but it was gone in an instant. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I don't know what you're referring to, Samantha," Richard said, his voice cool. "Your father's will has already been executed. The terms have been made clear to your family." "But why wasn't I told about it?" Samantha pressed, her voice rising with frustration. "If this document is real, then why didn't anyone mention it? Why was I excluded from everything?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Samantha, your father's will is a private matter. I can't discuss the specifics with you." Samantha's chest tightened. This wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. "I'm not here to argue, Richard. I'm here for the truth. I deserve to know what's going on." Richard hesitated for a moment, then reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a file. He placed it in front of her without a word. Samantha opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. The papers were similar to what she had seen in the box at home. More documents about the estate, about her father's investments, and most shockingly, a letter from her mother, Victoria. The letter was dated just a few weeks before her father's death. It was addressed to Richard Thompson, and it contained instructions for how the estate should be handled after her father's passing. But as Samantha read through it, her blood began to boil. The letter was vague, filled with legal jargon, but it was clear. Victoria had instructed Richard to keep certain details of the estate from Samantha. She had asked for a substantial portion of the assets to be kept out of Samantha's reach for reasons that were never explained. Samantha's hand shook as she put the papers down. Betrayal. That's what it felt like. Betrayal from the people she had trusted most in the world. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, had conspired with Jason and the family lawyer to keep her from her inheritance. They had decided she wasn't worthy of it, as if her father's careful planning had meant nothing. Richard watched her, his expression unreadable. Samantha, he began, his tone softer now. I know this is difficult, but your mother and Jason are doing what they believe is best for the family. Samantha stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't care what they believe is best. I care about the truth, and I'm going to find it. As she turned to leave, Richard's voice stopped her. Be careful, Samantha. You're walking a dangerous path. The warning fell on deaf ears. Samantha's mind was made up. She had seen enough. Her mother, Jason, and even Richard had been lying to her, hiding the truth of her father's will and the inheritance he had left her. The family she had once loved was nothing but a facade. The mask was slipping, and she wasn't going to sit back and let them get away with it. For the first time in days, Samantha felt a surge of clarity. She wasn't going to let them win. She was going to fight for what was rightfully hers. She was going to uncover every secret exposé, every lie, and reclaim her life. It was time for her to take control. The days after Samantha's meeting with Richard Thompson felt like a slow unraveling. Each conversation, each glance was filled with a sense of betrayal she couldn't ignore. The anger that had bubbled inside her since she discovered the will only grew, and every day she spent under the same roof as her mother Victoria and Jason felt like another heavy chain around her chest. Samantha couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. It was as if her entire world was a lie. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was something deeper, a cold realization that the people she had loved and trusted her entire life were capable of the most insidious betrayal. She thought about her father, how he had always been there for her, how he had provided for her. And now, here she was, left in the dark, excluded from the very inheritance he'd planned for her. The woman who had nurtured her, the mother who had seemed like a constant, was now just another player in a game that didn't involve her. The weight of it all settled heavily in her chest as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the papers she had gathered from Richard's office. The truth was right in front of her, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still missing something. There had to be more to this. She had to make them see her, make them understand what they had done. Her mind began to race, calculating her next move. Samantha had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background. But now, in the face of everything she had learned, she knew she couldn't just let this go. She couldn't allow her mother and brother to walk away from this without facing the consequences. Plan of action. Samantha knew that if she was going to take back control, she had to be strategic. She needed to confront Victoria and Jason, but she couldn't do it recklessly. They were both clever, and any hint of suspicion would send them running further into their web of lies. No, this had to be calculated. She had to make them believe they were in the clear, only to pull the rug out from under them at the right moment. A family dinner, an ordinary, simple affair. That was her plan. Samantha would invite Victoria and Jason to dinner just like old times. It would be an intimate gathering, something that would set them at ease. The last thing they would expect was a trap. But that was exactly what this dinner would be, a trap carefully crafted with years of accumulated knowledge. She knew everything about her family's secrets, the hidden financial dealings, the lies, the manipulations. But there was one thing her mother and brother didn't know. Samantha knew their weaknesses, their insecurities, their fears, and she was going to use every last one of them to expose them for who they really were. She spent the next few days preparing. Samantha pulled together everything she needed, photographs, documents, and the one thing that would guarantee the ultimate confrontation, a hidden recording of a conversation between Victoria and Jason. It was a conversation that had taken place just days before her father's death, a conversation that revealed their true intentions. Jason had been careless, and Samantha had been smart enough to record it. The night before the dinner, as she stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables, her mind wandered back to her childhood. The memories flooded her, sharp and painful, like the taste of a dish she had long forgotten. She had been so close to her family back then. She remembered the way her father used to lift her up in the air, his deep laugh resonating in the house, how he made her feel like she could conquer the world. She remembered the evenings spent in front of the fireplace, her mother reading to her, holding her close as the fire crackled in the background. Those moments felt so far away now, like they belonged to someone else's life. A moment of reflection. Samantha leaned against the counter, the knife frozen in her hand as she let the memories wash over her. She thought about those nights when her father would take her out to the backyard, showing her the stars and teaching her about the constellations. He had always been her protector, her champion. But now he was gone, and the only thing left were the shattered pieces of a family that was no longer whole. Her gaze shifted to the window where the evening sun dipped below the horizon. For a moment, the world outside seemed peaceful, serene even. But the quiet was deceptive. It mirrored the calm before the storm that Samantha knew was about to erupt. She couldn't let herself be swayed by nostalgia. Her father was gone, and the people who had once been her family had betrayed her. She took a deep breath, wiping her hands on a towel. It was time to make them see her not as the quiet daughter who had always followed their rules, but as someone who was finally ready to take a stand. The family dinner. The evening of the dinner arrived. Samantha had planned everything down to the smallest detail, carefully prepared the meal, set the table with the same silverware her family had used for years, and arranged everything to appear as if nothing had changed. She wore her mother's favorite dress, the one she had always worn at family gatherings, and set her hair just the way her father had liked it, loose and natural. It felt strange, almost wrong, but it was all part of the plan. Jason arrived first, looking as casual as ever, his smile quick and rehearsed. He had always been able to charm his way into any situation, and tonight would be no different. He seemed oblivious to the tension hanging in the air, his usual nonchalance making Samantha's skin crawl. Victoria followed shortly after, her perfectly tailored outfit and flawless makeup, only serving to highlight the coldness that radiated from her. Samantha could feel her mother's eyes on her, assessing, calculating as if nothing had changed. As if Samantha wasn't the same girl who had once looked up to her, adored her. They sat at the table, and for a moment everything felt normal. The conversation was light, almost forced. Jason talked about his latest business venture, and Victoria asked Samantha about her plans, but it all felt shallow, like an act they were all playing. Samantha remained calm, the quiet daughter they all expected her to be. She made polite conversation all the while, knowing the storm was coming. The reveal. Halfway through the meal, Samantha stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Jason and Victoria stopped mid-conversation, startled by her sudden movement. She walked over to the sideboard where she had placed a small stack of papers earlier in the evening. "I've been thinking," Samantha said, her voice steady, but her heart was pounding, "about the way things have gone since Dad's passing." She turned and faced them, her eyes cold, her heart hardening with every word she spoke. "I found something," she continued, her gaze shifting between her mother and brother. "Something that you've both been hiding from me." Victoria's face paled and Jason's eyes flickered with panic. Samantha reached for the papers on the table, holding up the will in front of them. "This is the real will," she said. "Not the one you showed everyone after Dad died, the one that was hidden from me, the one that shows how my father truly felt about me. He left me his wealth just like he promised." She let the words hang in the air. She could see their faces change, Jason's mask slipping for just a moment, and Victoria's cool demeanor faltering. Samantha wasn't finished yet. "There's more," she added, pulling out the recording device from her pocket. "This is a conversation you two had just days before Dad died. You think I didn't know? You think I wouldn't find out about the lies you've been telling me?" She pressed play. The recording filled the room, the sound of Jason's voice betraying everything he and Victoria had tried to hide. Flashbacks and heartbreak. Samantha's mind flashed back to the days when they had been a family. The dinners, the laughter, the love. How had it all come to this? Her heart ached, but there was no time for grief now. They had made their choice, and now she had to make hers. "I'm done being your pawn," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You won't take what's mine." As the last words of the recording echoed in the room, Jason and Victoria sat in stunned silence. There was no more pretending, no more masks. The truth was out. "Idol." And with that, Samantha knew this was only the beginning. The battle had just begun. The evening was unusually quiet as Samantha, Victoria, and Jason gathered around the dinner table, the same oak table where so many family meals had taken place over the years. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, each one of them keenly aware of the silent tension that hung in the air. Samantha had planned this dinner with meticulous care. She had made their favorite dishes, set the table with the same silverware her mother had always insisted on, and even arranged the candles just so, making the evening feel like a return to normal. but everything about tonight would be anything but normal. Jason, as always, was the first to arrive. He walked in with his usual confident swagger, offering his trademark smile, though it seemed a bit more strained than usual. He greeted Samantha with a nod and a casual, "Hey," before sitting down at his spot. Victoria, ever the poised figure, entered next, offering only a brief, almost mechanical smile to her daughter as she took her place at the table. The exchange was polite, but lacked the warmth that had once characterized their family gatherings. Samantha could feel the distance the walls that had slowly built up over the past few days. For a moment, everything felt routine until Samantha decided it was time to speak up. "Jason, Mom." She began, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that made both of them look up from their plates. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad's will lately." The words hung in the air for a moment like a cold breeze cutting through a warm room. Jason shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing just enough for Samantha to catch the shift. Victoria remained perfectly still, her hand pausing mid-air as she brought her glass of wine to her lips. Samantha could see the tension in her mother's posture, the way her fingers gripped the stem of the glass trying to maintain control. "I'm sure you've both been handling everything on your own." Samantha continued, her voice steady, but the words carrying a sharpness she could no longer contain. "But I found something. Something important." Jason cleared his throat, a nervous laugh escaping him. "What are you talking about? Everything's been handled, Sam. You don't need to worry about it." Samantha's eyes didn't leave his. She knew Jason well, his tendency to deflect with humor, his usual charm that had always gotten him out of tough situations. But tonight, she wouldn't let him get away with it. "I'm talking about the will, Jason. The real will," she said, her voice now cutting through the air like a knife. She placed the documents on the table in front of them, the thick stack of papers that had changed everything. "This one," she continued, "clearly shows that I was supposed to inherit part of the estate just like Dad promised me." Victoria's hand shook slightly as she lowered her glass, her face suddenly pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Jason was silent now, his eyes darting between Samantha and their mother, his face tightening with each passing second. "You were supposed to be told, Sam," Victoria finally said, her voice smooth but laced with something darker. "But we didn't think you'd handle it well. Your father made decisions for a reason. It's not about what's fair, it's about what's right for the family." Samantha felt a surge of anger rise within her, her pulse quickening. "What's right for the family?" She repeated the words, tasting bitter on her tongue. "You mean what's right for you, Mom? For both of you?" Jason shot her a quick warning glance, but Samantha wasn't backing down now. She was done being silent, done being invisible. "I saw the letter, Victoria. The one you wrote to Richard Thompson. I know everything about your little plan to keep me out of this," Samantha said, her eyes hardening as she looked at her mother. "I'm not some naive little girl anymore. I'm not going to sit here and let you use me, manipulate me like I'm some pawn in your game." Jason opened his mouth to say something, but Samantha raised her hand, cutting him off. "No, Jason. I'm done. You and Mom have been lying to me for months. I don't care what kind of act you're putting on. I know the truth now." The silence in the room was deafening. Jason's mouth tightened into a thin line, his jaw clenched as he looked at Samantha with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Victoria, on the other hand, remained eerily calm, though the coldness in her eyes spoke volumes. "You think you're entitled to this, don't you?" Victoria's voice was low, almost mocking. "You think that just because your father left you a little something that somehow gives you the right to come in here and disrupt everything we've worked for? You don't understand, Samantha. You never have." The words hit Samantha like a slap. For a moment, she felt a pang of something deep inside her, something that felt like a mix of heartbreak and betrayal. She had always idolized her mother. She had always believed Victoria had her best interests at heart. But now those beliefs were shattered and the truth was staring her in the face. "You've always been the golden child, Jason," Samantha continued, her voice growing colder. "The one who could do no wrong. The one who always got the attention. And I've been in the shadows watching you two run this family like it was some business deal." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling with the emotion she had kept hidden for so long. "But I'm done with that. I'm not going to let you take everything from me. Not anymore." Jason stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with force. "You're out of line, Sam," he spat, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about. We've been looking out for you, for the family. You think this is easy for me, for Mom? You think it's easy to keep up appearances when we're all falling apart inside? Samantha stood up as well, her heart racing. If you cared about me, Jason, you wouldn't have kept this from me. You wouldn't have treated me like I didn't matter. You wouldn't have let me live in the dark while you and Mom played your games. There was a long pause, the tension in the room palpable. Jason's chest rose and fell with each breath, his face flushed with anger. Victoria, though, remained eerily composed, her eyes never leaving Samantha. But Samantha could see it now. Beneath the facade, beneath the calm exterior, her mother was just as trapped as Jason. They were both afraid. Afraid of being exposed, afraid that their lies were finally coming to light. Samantha took a deep breath and looked at both of them, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said quietly, but with a steel in her voice that made both of them flinch. "I won't let you use me or manipulate me any longer." Jason looked as though he might say something, but his words caught in his throat. He seemed torn between the facade he'd spent years building and the reality that his sister wasn't going to play along anymore. He clenched his fists, then slowly sat back down. His eyes darkened with frustration. Victoria let out a slow, almost imperceptible sigh. "This isn't over, Samantha," she said quietly, her tone devoid of emotion. "You think this is just about money, about a will? It's bigger than that. There's a lot more at stake here than you realize." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve was unshaken. She knew now what she had to do. She could no longer trust her family, not the way she used to. They had crossed a line and there was no going back. The game had changed. "Then let's make it clear, Mom," Samantha said, her voice steady. "I'm done playing by your rules. I'm going to take what's mine, and I won't stop until the truth comes out." As she stared at her mother and brother, Samantha knew this was only the beginning. The battle wasn't over. It was just starting. And she was ready. The silence after Samantha's declaration was suffocating. The air in the room felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. She stood facing Jason and Victoria, her heart pounding but her resolve steady. There was no going back now. She had already crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. Jason's face twisted into something between frustration and disbelief. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to the last thread of control he had over the situation. "Sam, you don't get it," he said, his voice low but edged with irritation. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be." His eyes darted over to Victoria for a brief moment, but his gaze quickly snapped back to Samantha. "This is family business, okay? You don't have the experience or the intelligence to understand it. It's complicated. We're doing this for everyone's good." The words stung each one sharper than the last, and Samantha had to resist the urge to lash out. "You think I'm too dumb to understand." Her voice was cold, and though she tried to keep it steady, the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "I understand perfectly, Jason. You're all just trying to cover your tracks, trying to sweep your lies under the rug and pretend everything's fine." Jason's eyes narrowed and his lips curled into a sneer. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You've always been the quiet one, Sam, always in the background. This is how the real world works. We do what we have to do to survive. Your father wasn't perfect, and neither are any of us. But you don't get to just walk in here and start tearing things apart because you're angry." Samantha's blood boiled. He was trying to paint this as if it were her fault, like she was the one making things complicated. He wanted to portray her as the child throwing a tantrum, completely ignoring the truth that he and Victoria had been conspiring behind her back, stripping her of everything that was rightfully hers. "You've never had to work for anything in your life, Jason," she shot back, her voice rising now, no longer holding back. "You've been handed everything, always living in Dad's shadow, but you can't keep hiding behind him anymore. You and Mom destroyed everything. You think I don't see it? I see it now, all of it." Victoria, who had been eerily silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice was as calm and controlled as ever, but there was an underlying sharpness in it, like the edge of a knife being honed to a perfect point. "Enough," Samantha Victoria said, her tone cold, but even. She didn't even look at her daughter as she spoke, her gaze focused on her plate as if she were speaking to a child who was misbehaving. "You don't understand what you're talking about. You're upset, and I get that, but this is not the time to act out." Samantha's chest tightened with the force of 1,000 emotions, betrayal, frustration, heartbreak, all colliding at once. She couldn't believe this was happening. It was as if Victoria was living in a different reality, one where she was the victim, and Samantha was simply an obstacle to be ignored and dismissed. "No, Mom," Samantha replied, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. You don't get it. This isn't about me throwing a tantrum. This is about you and Jason taking everything from me. You're both so wrapped up in your own lies that you don't even see what you've done. You've made me the villain in this story. You've made me the one who doesn't belong here, but it's you who've turned this family into a lie. Victoria finally looked up, her eyes locking with Samantha's. For the briefest of moments, there was something like regret in her gaze, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by a wall of indifference. You're wrong, Samantha, she said softly, the calmness of her voice belying the venom in her words. You don't know what's best for you. You've always been so sensitive. Your father and I did what we had to do to keep everything running smoothly. This was never about you, Sam. It was about protecting the family, protecting what we've built. Samantha stared at her mother, disbelief settling deep in her bones. Protecting the family, by lying to me, by cutting me out of everything, by treating me like a stranger in my own home. Her voice was trembling now, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest like a 1,000-pound stone. But she wouldn't let herself cry, wouldn't let them see her weakness. Not now. Not when she was finally standing up for herself. Victoria's face remained unreadable. Her expression frozen like the mask she had worn for years was now a permanent fixture. This isn't a game, Samantha, she said, her voice eerily calm. We're doing what we have to do. The will, the money, it's all just part of it. You can't keep fighting against it. You're only hurting yourself. Jason let out a sharp laugh, the sound almost too loud in the otherwise silent room. See, Mom gets it. You're just being irrational, Sam. You're too caught up in your emotions to understand what's really going on here. Samantha's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She had always known Jason was selfish, but hearing him speak so coldly, so dismissively of everything she had worked for, everything she had lost, it broke something inside her. It was like she was being torn in two. Watching the brother she had once loved become someone unrecognizable, someone willing to throw her under the bus just to protect his own interests. You're wrong, Jason, she said, her voice cutting through the tension sharper than ever. You're not protecting the family. You're destroying it. You're tearing it apart. And you think I'm the problem? You think I'm the one who's ruining everything? No, you and Mom are the ones who've made this into a war, and I'm not going to sit here and let you win. Jason's face twisted in anger. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. You're unbelievable, Sam. You don't know anything. You think you can just walk in here and take what's ours, what we worked for. He paused for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the effort to keep his cool. You're not entitled to anything. Samantha stood her ground, feeling the rage surge through her veins. She had had enough of this, enough of their manipulation, enough of their lies, and enough of their delusions. Maybe not, but I'm entitled to the truth, she shot back. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you've done. No more lies, no more pretending. Jason's face reddened, his fists clenched tightly. He took a step toward her, but Victoria, who had remained calm throughout their argument, raised her hand, signaling him to stop. Samantha could see the slightest flicker of unease in her mother's eyes, but it was gone before she could fully register it. You don't understand, Samantha, Victoria said, her voice colder than ever. You think exposing us will fix everything? You think tearing us apart will give you what you want? You're wrong. For a long moment, the room was silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the seconds dragging by like hours. Samantha's heart was pounding, her hands trembling as she stood facing her family, realizing that the people she had once trusted were the ones who had hurt her the most. But this time, she wasn't backing down. She wouldn't let them continue to control her life, to manipulate her into believing that their version of the truth was the only one that mattered. She had come this far, and now she was going to make them see her. Finally. I'm not going anywhere, Samantha said, her voice steady, the conviction in her words cutting through the tension. And I'm not backing down. This ends now. Jason and Victoria exchanged a long look, one that spoke volumes about the battle that was about to come. Neither of them said anything, but the air between them was thick with the promise of something darker, something far from over. And Samantha knew it. The war was just beginning. Samantha sat in her bedroom, the papers from Richard's office spread out before her like a battlefield. Her eyes scanned the documents again and again, as if looking for some shred of hope, some piece of evidence that would allow her to walk away from all of this without having to go through with her plan. But the truth was clear, and there was no escaping it. Her father's estate, her inheritance, it had all been stolen from her, hidden away in plain sight, covered up by the very people who should have protected her. For days she had been toying with the idea of confronting her family with everything she had uncovered, but the weight of it all, of what it meant, what it would do to her, was heavy. Samantha had always believed that family was sacred, that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. But now, with her mother and brother betraying her at every turn, she realized just how hollow that belief was. They had betrayed her trust, her love, and now they would have to face the consequences. The idea of facing them was terrifying. It wasn't just the fear of losing everything, of having her mother and brother hate her for revealing their secrets. It was the fear of being completely alone, of standing up to the very people who had once been her world. She had spent so many years trying to make her family proud, trying to be the daughter they wanted her to be. But now she had to let go of that. She couldn't be the person they wanted her to be anymore. She had to be the person who fought for herself, for her own future. The plan had been taking shape for days now, each piece of the puzzle clicking into place. She would gather all the evidence she had, her father's real will, the recordings of Jason and Victoria's conversation, the documents showing their attempts to manipulate her father's estate, and present it to them in front of everyone. She needed to take back control, to show them that she wasn't just the quiet, invisible daughter anymore. She was done being the victim. But as the day of the confrontation drew closer, fear crept in. Would they turn on her completely? Would they try to destroy her just like they had tried to destroy her father's legacy? Samantha wasn't sure, but she knew one thing: she couldn't live with herself if she didn't do this. If she didn't expose the truth, then she was just as complicit as they were. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling landscape beyond the house. It was beautiful, serene, but it felt like a prison now. Everything she had once loved about this place, the memories, the family gatherings, the laughter, had been tainted. It wasn't just the house that had changed, it was her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this home just a few weeks ago. The woman who had trusted, who had believed in her family, was gone. In her place was a woman who was determined to take back what was rightfully hers. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Jason. "We need to talk. Can you meet tomorrow?" Samantha's stomach churned as she stared at the message. What could he possibly want to say now? She knew he wasn't reaching out to apologize. He wanted to try to convince her that everything was fine, that she was overreacting, that she was being dramatic. For a moment she considered ignoring him. Let him come to her, let him beg for her forgiveness. But then she realized that was exactly what they wanted, for her to back down, to hide in fear. No, she wasn't going to let that happen. She was going to meet him, but on her terms. She would make sure he understood that this was no longer his game. Samantha took a deep breath and typed her response. "Fine. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'll be there." She hit send and put the phone down, the weight of her decisions settling over her. Tomorrow it would all come to light. The lies, the manipulation, everything they had done to her, all of it would be exposed. And no matter what happened, she would stand her ground. The night before the confrontation, Samantha couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with memories of her childhood, of days spent laughing with Jason, of warm summer nights when the family would gather around the dinner table sharing stories and making plans. Those memories now felt like they belonged to someone else. The family she had known was gone, and in its place was a hollow shell. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear her father's voice comforting her, telling her everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. And it hadn't been okay for a long time. Her father had been the one person she could trust, the one person who would always have her back. But now he was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much she had lost. She had lost her father, her family, and her sense of security. But the truth was, she hadn't just lost them. They had lost her. They had pushed her away, betrayed her, and made her feel like she didn't matter. And now Samantha was done playing their game. The morning came quickly, and with it a new sense of purpose. Samantha dressed carefully, choosing a dark formal outfit, a simple black dress that would make her look powerful, unshakable. She couldn't afford to show any weakness, not now. She spent the day organizing the documents, the evidence she had gathered over the past few days. She made sure everything was in order, each page, each piece of paper carefully laid out. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every word she spoke tonight would be weighed carefully. She had to make them see the truth, to make them understand that she was no longer the quiet daughter they had ignored. She was someone who could stand up for herself, someone who would fight for what was hers. As the evening approached, the air seemed heavier, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her. She took one last look at herself in the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, and for the first time in a long time, Samantha saw someone strong. Someone capable. Someone ready to face the truth, no matter the cost. She walked downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Jason would be there soon and everything would change. She knew it. This was the moment that would define everything. Samantha stood in the hallway, staring at the door. She could hear the faint sound of Jason's car pulling into the driveway. This was it. She took one last deep breath, gathering her strength, and then she opened the door. "Let's do this," she whispered to herself, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. The evening had arrived, and with it the weight of Samantha's decision. The house felt eerily quiet as she set the table. The china that had once symbolized family warmth now seemed like an artifact of a different life. She moved with purpose, every movement sharp and deliberate as she prepared for what was about to unfold. Tonight would not be a typical family dinner, it would be the moment of reckoning. It had to be. Her heart raced in her chest, but the feeling was different this time. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It was resolve, a fierce determination that had burned in her ever since she discovered the truth. She wasn't just sitting down to dinner with her family, she was sitting down to a battle. The stakes had never been clearer. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about reclaiming herself, reclaiming her dignity, reclaiming her voice. The doorbell rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Jason and Victoria had arrived. Samantha's pulse quickened, but she held steady. The plan was simple. Draw them in, let them believe they could still control the situation, and then strike when they least expected it. They were too comfortable, too assured in their lies. They wouldn't see this coming. But Samantha was ready. She had been preparing for this moment for far too long to back down now. Jason walked in first, his usual charm intact. He smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something strained about him tonight, like he was trying too hard to keep up appearances. Samantha noticed the way his gaze quickly flicked to Victoria, as though searching for reassurance. He couldn't hide the tension in his posture. He knew something was wrong, but didn't yet realize just how badly the situation was about to explode. Victoria followed closely behind, her usual composure in place. She glided into the room, her movements precise, her eyes scanning the space with that all-too-familiar coldness. But even she seemed slightly off tonight, as if she knew something had shifted. Samantha met their eyes as they sat down at the table, the air between them thick with anticipation. The lights overhead cast long shadows on the walls, and the flickering candle flames on the table seemed to mirror the fire building inside of her. "Dinner looks wonderful, Sam," Victoria said, her voice cool but polite. She didn't make eye contact, busying herself with the silverware as if everything were perfectly normal. Samantha took a deep breath, her hand resting on the back of the chair. This was it. "Thanks, Mom," Samantha said, her voice steady. "I thought it was time we had a real conversation." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Jason stiffened, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Victoria didn't react, though her fingers paused mid-air as she picked up a spoon. She had been so practiced in pretending that Samantha almost wondered if she could keep up the act, or if the truth would finally crack her perfect mask. "I know what you've both been doing," Samantha continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "I know about the lies, the manipulation, and the way you've been trying to take what belongs to me." Jason's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to speak, but Samantha cut him off. "You don't get to speak, Jason," she said coldly, locking eyes with him. "I've seen everything. The way you've been working with Mom to hide the will to push me aside and steal what was rightfully mine." Jason's face reddened as he leaned back in his chair, suddenly defensive. "You're overreacting, Sam. You don't know everything. You don't understand how complicated this all is. This wasn't personal, it was business." Samantha scoffed, her frustration building. "Business. You're calling this business. This is my life, Jason. This is about my father's legacy, and you've been too busy stealing from me to care about that." Victoria's face remained frozen, her composure unshaken. She set her fork down slowly and turned her gaze towards Samantha, her eyes narrowing. "Sam, please. This is not how we should be handling this. You're too emotional. This is bigger than just you." Samantha's chest tightened. "Bigger than me," she repeated. "This is my inheritance, my father's trust. You've been lying to me, manipulating me, and I'm done letting you get away with it." The words had hit their mark. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze flickering to Victoria once more, searching for a sign that they could regain control of the situation. But Samantha was no longer the daughter who kept quiet. She wasn't going to let them spin their lies any longer. "I found everything you know," Samantha went on, her voice steady but rising with each passing moment. "The letters, the documents, the recording." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out the recorder she had hidden, placing it on the table in front of them. "I heard the conversation you had, Jason. The one where you planned to keep me out of everything. The one where you and Mom decided I didn't deserve what was mine." Jason's eyes widened, his face draining of color. Victoria's calm demeanor faltered for just a moment, a flicker of panic flashing across her face before she regained her composure. "Samantha, don't do this," she said, her voice tight, no longer the smooth, controlled tone it had once been. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." "I don't think I will," Samantha shot back, her voice cold and resolute. "You've done enough, Mom. Enough to me, enough to my father. And I'm not going to sit here and let you lie your way out of it anymore." The tension in the room was palpable, a standoff between mother and daughter that had been years in the making. Samantha wasn't just confronting them about money, she was confronting them about everything. The lies, the manipulation, the years of being pushed aside, ignored, made to feel less than. It was all out in the open now. Jason opened his mouth to speak again, but this time Samantha didn't give him the chance. "You both made a choice," she said, her voice low but firm. "And now you'll have to live with it." There was a moment of silence, an unbearable quiet that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Jason's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, he didn't seem so confident. Victoria, too, seemed rattled. She had always prided herself on being in control, but now she was the one on the defensive. "I've already lost my father," Samantha continued, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve unwavering. "But I'm not going to lose myself, too. I won't let you do this to me." Jason stood abruptly, slamming his hand against the table. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You're just a spoiled little girl who can't see the bigger picture." Samantha stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not the one who's spoiled, Jason. I'm the one who's been ignored, cast aside while you've been taking everything from me, and I'm done letting you win." Victoria finally stood as well, her expression cold as she faced her daughter. "You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about you, it's about the family. It's about survival." Samantha let out a bitter laugh. "Survival? You mean you and Jason protecting yourselves at my expense? You think I don't see through this? You're lying to everyone, Mom. And I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their shallow breathing. It was clear now the battle lines had been drawn. There was no going back, no more pretending. Samantha wasn't just protecting her inheritance anymore. She was protecting her soul, her dignity, her future. And tonight, for the first time in her life, she had taken control. The truth was out, and no matter what happened next, Samantha knew one thing: this fight was hers to win. The air in the dining room was thick with tension, a palpable weight that seemed to settle deeper with each passing second. Samantha stood her ground, her back straight, her eyes never wavering from Jason or Victoria. The anger that had been building inside her for months, for years, had finally exploded, and now there was no turning back. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this house a week ago, meek and unsure. No, tonight she was someone who had faced the truth, and the truth was a weapon she wasn't afraid to wield. Victoria, once the epitome of grace and control, stood in front of Samantha, her posture rigid and her eyes cold. Her lips trembled slightly, but the fury behind her gaze was undeniable. "You've ruined everything," Samantha Victoria spat, her voice thick with disdain. "This is all your fault. You've torn this family apart, and for what? A few dollars? A piece of property?" Samantha's chest tightened at her mother's words, but she didn't flinch. If anything, it only solidified her resolve. The woman she had once adored, the woman who had promised her everything, was standing before her, accusing her of destroying the very thing she had broken. The hypocrisy was staggering. "I ruined everything." Samantha's voice was a harsh whisper, each word a sharp blade. "No, Mom, you ruined everything. You and Jason have been playing games with my life, lying, cheating, manipulating. I'm just the one who finally called you out on it." Jason, who had been silent for far too long, slammed his fist onto the table. "You don't understand. None of you understand." His voice was rising, his face flushed with frustration. "This wasn't about you, Sam. This was about keeping the family intact. We did what we had to do. Samantha could see the cracks in his facade now, the carefully constructed walls of his self-righteousness beginning to crumble. He was no longer the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. No, now he was just a man cornered by his own lies, grasping for control he no longer had. You kept me out of the family for your own benefit. Jason. Samantha shot back, her voice now cutting through the air with the fury of years of being silenced. This wasn't about keeping the family intact. This was about you and Mom making sure you both stayed in control, and I'm sick of being the one left in the dark. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and the venom in her voice became more pronounced. You don't even realize how selfish you are, do you, Samantha? You've always been so focused on your own little world. It was easier for you to hide away in your books to let us handle things than to actually step up and be part of the family. Samantha's eyes burned with the intensity of the accusation, but instead of shrinking away, she stepped closer, her voice unwavering. You think this was about me hiding away? I was never given a choice, Mom. I was never asked to be a part of anything. You kept me at arm's length, pushed me aside like I was nothing. Now that I finally stand up, I'm the problem. Victoria took a sharp breath as though trying to steady herself, but her voice trembled with barely contained rage. This family was fine before you started interfering. We didn't need you to make everything harder. You think you fought for your rights? You think you're entitled to any of this? You're wrong! Jason, who had been pacing angrily, shot a glance at his mother, his face still twisted with anger. He turned to Samantha, his voice lower now, but still charged with frustration. You think this was easy for us? You think we just made decisions for the hell of it? We were trying to make things work without you throwing everything into chaos. If you just stayed out of it, none of this would have happened. Samantha stared at him, her heart racing, but her mind clear. You think I'm the one who's causing chaos? You've been lying to me for months, Jason. Years. Her voice cracked with the emotion that had been building up inside her for so long. I didn't want to be part of your game. I just wanted to be part of my family. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jason faltered. His shoulders slumped and he looked away, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he could no longer face the truth staring him in the face. It was too much for him to process, too much for him to take responsibility for. Victoria crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face now a mask of cold indifference. She had no words left for her daughter. The woman who had once been the center of Samantha's world now stood there, not even willing to offer an apology, not even willing to admit she had done anything wrong. Samantha felt a sick twist in her stomach as the truth settled in. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. This wasn't just about what was fair or who was entitled to what. It was about everything she had once believed to be true, the family bond, the love, the trust, and how quickly it had all been shattered. She had been naive to think it could ever be different. Her parents had never seen her, not really. They had seen a daughter who could be molded into whatever they needed. But she wasn't that girl anymore. I'm done with you both, Samantha said quietly, the words heavy with finality. The emotion she had felt, the hurt, the betrayal faded, replaced by something harder, something sharper. She had nothing left to lose. I'm done trying to be part of a family that never wanted me. I won't apologize for exposing the truth. I won't apologize for standing up for myself. Jason's eyes snapped to hers, fury igniting behind his gaze. You think you've won? He hissed. You think the truth makes you better than us. It doesn't. It makes you weak. You're nothing but a child throwing a tantrum because you didn't get your way. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't scared. She wasn't intimidated. The time for fear was over. She had taken her stand, and nothing he said would change that. No, Jason, she said, her voice low but unwavering. It makes me stronger, and I'm done letting you both drag me down. Victoria remained silent, but Samantha could see the anger, the resentment simmering just below the surface. This was not the mother she had known, the one who had held her and comforted her. This woman was a stranger, and nothing would ever be the same again. You'll regret this, Victoria said at last, her voice colder than ever, the words chilling Samantha to her core. But instead of feeling fear, Samantha felt only a sense of liberation. No, Mom. You're wrong, she said. I'm not the one who's going to regret this. You are. For a moment, everything was still. The room felt like it was holding its breath, as if the house itself was waiting for the final words to be spoken. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the background, marking the passage of time that had been so cruelly distorted by the lies they had all lived. Samantha took one last look at her family, at the two people who had once been her world, and turned away. There was no more need for words. She had done what she had to do. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time she was in control. "Goodbye, Jason. Goodbye, Mom," she whispered almost to herself as she walked out of the room, leaving the shattered remnants of her family behind her. The next few days were a blur of activity, but Samantha didn't mind. She was laser-focused, her mind running on a single track as she methodically continued to uncover the depths of her family's deception. The truth had already been revealed to her, but now she needed to make sure that no stone went unturned. It wasn't enough to just expose the lies, she needed proof. She needed something solid, something that would leave no room for doubt. The first place she turned to was her father's real estate dealings. Jason had always been involved in the family business, managing properties and investments under the guise of keeping the family legacy intact. But Samantha knew better now. Jason's connections, especially with the real estate company her father had worked with for decades, were more than just professional. They were personal. They were part of the scheme, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Samantha had already gained access to some of her father's old files, but there were more hidden away. She spent hours combing through dusty drawers in her father's office, her fingers brushing against the worn leather of his old briefcases, finding things she had never thought to look for before. And then, buried beneath a pile of old papers, she found them email threads. They weren't from her father, but from Jason. Her fingers shook as she opened the first email. The subject line alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. Confidential transfer of funds from estate account. The thread was from the very real estate firm her father had trusted for years, and it outlined the transfer of significant funds from the family's estate to an account under Jason's name. The details were clear. Jason had been siphoning money from the estate long before her father's death. It was a systematic theft hidden behind a veil of business deals and legal jargon. Samantha felt her stomach churn as she scrolled through the emails, each one more damning than the last. Jason had been using the company to line his pockets, diverting funds into his own personal account under the guise of legitimate transactions. But the emails were only the beginning. Samantha needed more than just digital trails. She needed physical proof, and that meant tracking down people who had been involved in the transactions. She had always been cautious about who she trusted, but now her growing network of contacts, people who had worked with her father or had been around during the property deals, became her greatest asset. She reached out to the employees at the real estate company, careful to remain discreet, knowing she couldn't trust anyone completely, not yet. The first person to respond was Jason's former assistant, a woman named Ellen, who had worked with the family for years. Samantha had met her only once or twice when she was younger, and she hadn't thought much of their brief interactions. But now Ellen was the key to exposing Jason's web of lies. Ellen was cautious at first, hesitant to speak out for fear of retaliation from Jason, but after some persuasion, she agreed to meet in person. Samantha chose a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough from prying eyes, but close enough to give her access to any last-minute information. When Ellen arrived, she was visibly nervous, her eyes darting around as if she expected Jason to walk in at any moment. Samantha couldn't blame her. The fear was real, the power imbalance was clear. But Ellen was tired of being silent, tired of being part of something that wasn't right. "I've seen the emails," Samantha said quietly, her eyes fixed on Ellen. "I know what Jason has been doing. I need you to help me understand how it all started." Ellen hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it was wrong at first. I thought it was just business. Jason always made it sound like it was for the good of the family, but the more I saw, the more I realized it wasn't what he said it was. Your father had no idea. He was too trusting of Jason. I didn't know how to stop it. But now it's too far." Ellen leaned forward, glancing around nervously. She pulled out a small folded sheet of paper from her purse and slid it across the table to Samantha. It was a ledger, a record of transactions that had never been logged in the official company books. There were names on the list, names of other companies, some offshore accounts, and most troubling of all, Jason's signature. It was clear. He had been laundering money, moving funds from the estate to shell companies, using the family's assets to fuel his own wealth. Samantha took the paper with shaking hands, her breath catching in her throat. The evidence was in her hands now. She had what she needed to make the truth undeniable. But the feeling that washed over her wasn't relief, it was the weight of what she had to do next. She wasn't just about to expose Jason, she was about to dismantle everything he had worked so hard to build. He would lose everything. And that thought, that moment of reckoning, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As she stood to leave, Ellen grabbed her arm gently. "Please be careful, Samantha," she said, her voice low and trembling. "Jason won't take this lying down. He'll do anything to protect himself. And your mother? I'm afraid she'll do whatever it takes to defend him." Samantha nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. Fear had no place in this fight. She had been pushed to the edge, and now she was ready to push back. Over the next few days, Samantha continued to gather witnesses, tracking down others who had been involved in the family business, employees who had witnessed Jason's unethical dealings, contractors who had been paid off to keep quiet, and even the lawyers who had been complicit in covering up the money laundering. Every conversation, every document brought her closer to the moment of truth. She could feel it now. The inevitable confrontation was coming. The family, the empire Jason had built on lies and greed, was about to come crumbling down. And yet, despite the growing sense of victory that fueled her every step, there was a lingering pain in Samantha's heart. She was no longer the person who would let this slide, no longer the daughter who would silently suffer in the background. But there was a cost to that strength, a cost she could no longer ignore. The people she had once loved, the people who had raised her, were no longer the ones she could count on. They were the very reason she had to fight. For the first time in weeks, Samantha allowed herself a moment to breathe, to step back, and reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She wasn't the girl she once was. She wasn't the child hiding in the shadows. She was a woman standing in her truth, ready to tear down the walls that had kept her trapped for far too long. The next move was hers. The next step would decide everything. But as she looked at the evidence she had gathered, she knew there was no turning back now. It was time for the truth to be heard, and for the world to see who Jason and Victoria really were. Samantha was no longer afraid. The fight had only just begun. The days leading up to the court hearing felt like a relentless march towards something inevitable. Samantha had been preparing herself for this battle for weeks, but now that it was finally here, the weight of it all began to press down on her. The evidence was irrefutable. The lies were clear, but facing her family in court, standing before a judge, and exposing everything they had done was a different beast entirely. She sat in her small apartment late one evening, surrounded by piles of legal documents, contracts, and records. She'd spent the last few days meeting with lawyers, gathering every shred of evidence and meticulously planning her next moves. She had to be ready for everything, every argument, every strategy, every loophole they might try to exploit. The reality of what she was about to do hit her like a wave. The first lawyer she had hired, a seasoned litigator named Michael Green, had been incredibly thorough. He was calm, methodical, and precise, never once questioning her resolve. He had assured her that with the evidence she had gathered, she stood a strong chance in court. But no matter how much reassurance he gave, no matter how many strategies they discussed, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that gripped her every time she closed her eyes. She had come to realize that this wasn't just a legal fight. It was a personal one. She wasn't just up against her mother and brother in court, she was up against the people who had raised her, shaped her, and loved her in their own twisted way. They had built a life of lies, and now she had to tear it all down. The fear of what that meant, of what it might cost her emotionally, was something she couldn't easily ignore. It wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about facing the aftermath. "Are you sure about this, Samantha?" Michael asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. She looked up from the document she was reading, startled to realize he had been talking to her for a few moments. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice strained barely above a whisper. "This fight, this is going to be brutal. You're going to be exposing your family's darkest secrets. Your mother and brother are not going to take this lying down, and once it's out there, there's no going back. You're going to have to live with the fallout." The reality of it hit her hard. She had known this, of course. She knew that her family would fight tooth and nail, that they wouldn't go down easily. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had seen cases like this before, made the truth feel so much more real. "I know," Samantha replied, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "But I have to do this. They've taken so much from me already. I've been silent for too long." Michael nodded, his face softening with understanding. "Just remember, Samantha, The law doesn't care about family loyalty. It only cares about facts, evidence, and truth. This is your chance to set things right. Samantha's eyes flickered to the stack of papers in front of her. The records of transactions, the emails, the ledger from Ellen, each piece of evidence a reminder of the betrayal that had led her here. She had everything she needed. She had proof. But the thought of standing in that courtroom facing Jason and Victoria, knowing they would try to manipulate the narrative, made her stomach churn. The next few days flew by in a blur. Samantha spent every waking moment poring over her case, preparing herself for the emotional toll it would take. She couldn't afford to falter. She couldn't afford to be weak. But even with all the preparation, there was still a part of her that hesitated. What if the judge didn't believe her? What if the jury sided with Jason and Victoria? What if the truth wasn't enough? Samantha pushed those thoughts aside. She had no choice but to believe in the evidence. She had to trust that what she had uncovered would be enough to expose the lies for what they were. On the eve of the trial, Samantha sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the city below. It was quiet, too quiet. She had always found comfort in the sound of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the bustle of life happening outside her window. But tonight it felt distant. The weight of the coming day pressed on her shoulders like an anchor threatening to pull her under. She had come so far. The moment of truth was almost here. But the fear, the deep gnawing fear of what was to come, still lingered. She thought about Jason and Victoria. She thought about the family she once had. Could she ever go back to what they had? Could she ever rebuild what had been broken? The thought of never speaking to them again, of being permanently estranged, made her chest tighten. But then she remembered the lies, the betrayal, the coldness with which they had treated her. The realization that they had been planning this for years, the manipulation, the deceit, the way they had pushed her aside, made her anger flare once more. She couldn't let that go, not anymore. As the night dragged on, Samantha's thoughts returned to Michael's words. The law doesn't care about family loyalty. And that was the truth, wasn't it? This was bigger than family. This was about justice. This was about doing what was right. The next morning, she woke early, as she always did when something important was ahead. The sunlight filtered in through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. For a moment, she closed her eyes, just letting herself breathe. When she opened them again, she knew what she had to do. She had already made the decision. There was no more room for doubt. There was no turning back. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her reverie. It was a message from Michael B. at the courthouse at 9 a.m. sharp. "This is your moment." Samantha stood up, her legs shaky, but her mind clearer than it had ever been. She grabbed her briefcase packed with the evidence she had spent so many days preparing. She adjusted her dress, a dark, simple outfit that felt appropriate for the battle ahead. It was time to face them. It was time to make sure they couldn't lie their way out of this. As she walked out of her apartment, locking the door behind her, Samantha felt a strange calm settle over her. For so long, she had let fear dictate her life. But now, as she stood on the precipice of everything she had worked for, she realized something important. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet on the polished floors. Samantha stood at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The air felt thick with anticipation, but she didn't flinch. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. She glanced across the room at her mother and brother. Victoria sat at the defense table, her expression a mask of calm that barely concealed the tightness around her eyes. Jason sat beside her, his usual confidence gone, replaced by an edge of anxiety he couldn't hide. His leg bounced nervously beneath the table, and his eyes kept darting around the room as though he was looking for a way out. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for so long. Every lie, every betrayal, every ounce of fear and doubt she had carried for weeks had led her here to this very moment in the courtroom. It was time for the truth to come to light. There was no turning back now. "Your Honor?" Samantha began, her voice steady as she addressed the judge. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she didn't let it distract her. "I am here today to expose the truth about what my family has done, what my mother and brother have done to me, to my father, and to the legacy he left behind." Her words hung in the air like a declaration, and she could feel the weight of them. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes now focused intently on her, but there was something in his gaze, fear. Victoria remained perfectly still. Her eyes narrowed in a way that made Samantha's stomach turn, but it was clear she hadn't expected this. The prosecution had already presented their case detailing the basic facts of the theft and the financial mismanagement that had led to her father's estate being siphoned off. But Samantha had something more, something deeper. She had the truth. She took a deep breath and reached into her briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents, each one more damning than the last. She turned toward the judge and handed over the evidence. "These are the records of transactions from my father's real estate business," Samantha said, her voice carrying with authority. "They show clear evidence of funds being diverted from my father's estate to an offshore account that Jason controlled. This is not just a mistake or oversight. This is theft, and it's been going on for years." The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern face, examined the documents before turning to Jason and Victoria, his expression unreadable. He nodded, gesturing for the defense to respond. Victoria's lips tightened, but she said nothing, as if the truth had already been decided for her. Jason, on the other hand, stood quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice rising. "These are just papers. What do you expect to prove with these?" His hands were trembling slightly, but he clenched them into fists at his sides. "This is a family matter. Samantha is just angry, confused. She doesn't understand what's been going on behind the scenes. This was never about her. This was about taking care of the family." Samantha fought the urge to scoff. She'd heard it all before, his manipulative words, his calm veneer that hid the panic beneath. This was not the same Jason she had grown up with. This was someone else, someone she barely recognized. She stood her ground. "Don't pretend this was about taking care of the family, Jason," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "This was about you taking what wasn't yours. You stole from me, from my father, and from this family." Jason's face flushed a deep red, and he sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. But the tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a personal one, and Jason knew it. Victoria, her face now ashen, finally spoke. "Samantha, you don't understand. You think that you can just throw all of this away, but you have no idea what's at stake. Your father, he wasn't as innocent as you think he was. He wasn't always the man you remember him to be. There were things you didn't know, things you'll never understand." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had been bracing for her mother's defense, but this was unexpected. Victoria's voice wavered, a slight crack in her otherwise unshakable demeanor. For a moment, Samantha saw it, the flicker of guilt, the cracks in her mother's carefully constructed world. "I understand perfectly," Samantha replied, her voice even. "I understand that you and Jason have been lying to me, using me, and now you're trying to justify it. But the truth is clear. I'm not here to destroy this family, Mom. I'm here to save it. I'm here to save myself." There was a quiet pause as the weight of her words settled in. Samantha didn't look at her mother. She didn't need to. She could feel the truth spreading in the room like wildfire, consuming the last remnants of the lies they had built their lives on. Samantha turned back to the judge and nodded. "I also have recordings of conversations between Jason and Victoria, conversations where they discuss the transfer of funds, where they plan how to hide the theft, where they talk about excluding me from my rightful inheritance. These aren't just documents, Your Honor. These are the voices of my family betraying me and my father." The judge's eyes widened slightly as he processed the weight of her words. He glanced at the defense table, his gaze piercing. "Samantha," Jason finally managed to say, his voice shaking, "you have no idea what you're doing. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. You're just tearing this family apart." Samantha stood tall, her shoulders squared. "I'm not tearing it apart, Jason. You did that. You and Mom. I'm just putting the pieces back together." The room seemed to grow colder as the truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Jason's attempts to argue, to manipulate the situation, fell flat. The lies he had spun were unraveling before his eyes, and all he could do was stare at the documents, the recordings, the undeniable proof of his betrayal. Victoria, her face pale and drawn, seemed to retreat into herself. Her defiance had turned to fear. Fear of the consequences of her actions coming to light. Samantha's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about her father's legacy, her own dignity, and the truth finally coming to light. She had taken a stand. She had fought for herself, for the justice that had been denied her. And in that moment, as Jason and Victoria sat there silent and exposed, Samantha knew that she had already won. Her battle wasn't over. But this was the turning point. The tide had turned and there was no going back. The lies had been exposed. The truth was finally irrevocably on her side. The gavel came down with a sharp echo that reverberated through the room, sealing the fate of the people who had once been her family. Samantha stood frozen for a moment, her eyes locked on the judge as he delivered his verdict. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. Her breath felt shallow, her heart thudding heavily in her chest, yet her body was numb. Jason Shaw and Victoria Shaw, you are both hereby found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud theft and the illegal diversion of assets. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. Samantha blinked, the weight of the words settling on her like a blanket of ice. Jason and Victoria's expressions had shifted from defiance to disbelief, and now to something darker fear. Jason's eyes flicked around the room, his chest heaving as if he couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. Victoria, on the other hand, sat stiffly, her lips pursed, her face drained of color. They were both stunned, the reality of their actions catching up with them far too late. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was over. For Jason and Victoria, it was the end of everything. But for Samantha, it was just the beginning. The officer stepped forward, and Jason's attempt to stand and plead with the judge was immediately halted by the cold grip of handcuffs. His voice cracked as he tried to speak, but his words fell on deaf ears. Victoria's hands trembled as she looked at the bailiff, her mouth opening and closing, as if she couldn't find the words to stop the inevitable. "Samantha, please," Jason called out, his voice desperate as they led him away. "You don't understand. This wasn't supposed to be like this. We were trying to protect you. We were doing it for the family." Samantha didn't respond. She couldn't. His words were empty, hollow. They had tried to justify their actions for months, manipulating her, pushing her aside, and for what? Power, control, greed. There was nothing left to say, nothing that would change what they had done. Victoria, her eyes wide with panic, turned to Samantha as she was escorted out of the courtroom. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You don't know what you're doing. You've ruined everything. You've destroyed us all." Samantha stood there, unmoving her body, a statue of resolve, but inside her heart was heavy, weighed down by the emptiness that was slowly consuming her. The truth had been revealed. They had paid the price for their lies and betrayal. But what did it matter if the people who were supposed to love her were gone? What was the point of victory if there was nothing left to save? The courtroom slowly emptied, the hum of conversations filling the space, but Samantha didn't hear them. She couldn't. Her mind was elsewhere, racing with the images of Jason and Victoria, her family being led away, their futures now in the hands of the law. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. She didn't need to hear from anyone. She didn't need anyone's congratulations or pity. She was done with all of it. Her lawyer, Michael Green, walked over to her, his face tight with a mixture of professional satisfaction and concern. "You did it, Samantha. You got them. This is a victory. You're free. The family will never be the same, but you've taken back what's yours." Samantha looked up at him, her expression hollow. "I didn't want this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want any of this." Michael paused, a frown pulling at the corners of his mouth. He could see the pain in her eyes, but he wasn't sure how to console her. "I know this was hard, but you did what you had to do. You couldn't let them keep going. You couldn't let them keep lying to you." Samantha nodded, but the words felt like hollow echoes in her mind. The fight was over, yes. Jason and Victoria would face the consequences, but in the end, what did it matter? She had won, and yet she felt like she had lost everything. That evening, Samantha found herself standing in her apartment, staring out the window at the city below. The view was beautiful, the skyline shimmering with the last light of day, but it all felt distant. The world had shifted so drastically for her in the past few months, and now even the things she once held dear seemed foreign, unrecognizable. She could hear the faint sound of her phone buzzing again from the other room, but she didn't move. The silence in her apartment was overwhelming, crushing. She had fought so hard for this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to do with herself. The courtroom had been a battlefield, a place where she had fought for her right to exist, to be seen, to be heard. But now that it was over, she felt empty. What was left? Her eyes moved slowly to the framed photo on the mantel, the last one of her and Jason together, smiling at a family event years ago. The image was a far cry from the harsh reality she faced now. That version of her family, the one that had held together, had cared for each other, was gone. In its place was something fractured, broken beyond repair. She reached for her phone and answered the call without checking who it was. Sam Michael's voice came through, his tone still upbeat. I know you're probably not feeling much right now, but you've done something incredible today. This is a huge win for you. Samantha's throat tightened. She could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she refused to let them. I didn't win Michael, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't win anything. I just lost everything. I thought that when I exposed the truth it would make me feel better, but it didn't. It just makes me feel empty. Michael was silent for a moment, probably unsure of how to respond. I know it's tough, he finally said, but the road ahead is yours now. You can start over, Sam. You don't have to carry the weight of them anymore. She didn't answer at first, the weight of his words sinking in. Could she really start over? Could she ever let go of the family she had lost? Or was she doomed to live with the pain of what they had done to her? I don't know if I can, she finally said, her voice trembling. I don't know who I am without them. The days following the verdict were a blur. The phone calls, the press, the legal proceedings, it all felt like too much. Samantha had never wanted the spotlight. She had never wanted the world to know the dark secrets of her family. But now that it was all out there, she was left with the aftermath, the silence that followed the storm. In the weeks that passed, Jason and Victoria's legal teams continued to fight, but the case was clear. They had no defense, no justification for their actions. They had stolen from her and betrayed the very foundation of the family. And yet, despite their impending sentences, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Her family was gone, torn apart by greed and betrayal. She had won the battle, but the war had cost her more than she could have ever imagined. The love she had once felt for them had been shattered, and in its place was a deep, aching emptiness. And in the quiet moments when she was alone, Samantha realized that victory had come at a terrible price. She had fought for justice, but in the end she was still fighting for the one thing she had lost: her family. The courtroom had grown eerily quiet, the silence amplifying the tension that seemed to hang in the air. The gavel had already fallen, the verdict was delivered, and yet the final moment of the trial had yet to unfold. Samantha stood at the plaintiff's table, her body still and unmoving, her eyes fixed ahead. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but she didn't allow herself to move. She couldn't. Not yet. Across the room, her mother Victoria sat at the defense table, her hands trembling in her lap. For the first time in the entire trial, she allowed herself to show a flicker of vulnerability. Her face, once so composed and cold, was streaked with tears. The mask was slipping. Victoria's sobs filled the space, sharp and guttural, a stark contrast to the usually poised woman Samantha had once known. She was no longer the confident, controlling mother who had carefully managed every aspect of their family life. She was broken, raw, and unrecognizable. The truth, the weight of the betrayal had shattered her. Please, Samantha. Victoria's voice cracked hoarse with emotion. She stood suddenly, her knees buckling beneath her as she reached across the table, pleading in a way that Samantha had never seen before. Don't do this. You don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about money. This is about family. You've ruined everything. I've given everything for this family, and you've taken it all away. Do you really think your father would want this? Her words echoed around the courtroom, but Samantha didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't respond. Victoria continued, her breath ragged, fighting to compose herself, but failing. You've always been so selfish, so wrapped up in your own little world. I did everything for you, for your future, for us, and this is how you repay me, by tearing us apart. She collapsed into her seat, her head bowed, her sobs now quiet, almost resigned. The judge, a tall, middle-aged man with tired eyes, watched silently, his expression impassive, as Victoria's breakdown continued. He hadn't expected this final emotional plea. He'd seen the facts, the evidence, and the guilt was undeniable. But now this was different. This was raw and messy human. It was the last desperate attempt from a mother who had lost everything. But Samantha stood frozen, unmoving. Her heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She felt no wave of emotion, no rush of triumph or sorrow. The numbness that had slowly settled over her for weeks now was all-consuming. She had long stopped feeling anything for the woman in front of her. Victoria's voice faltered again, quieter now. I did what I had to do, Sam. I loved you. But this wasn't a choice. It was survival. You don't understand the pressure I was under, the decisions I had to make. I didn't want this. Please just let me go. Let us go." Her words, however frantic and pleading, fell into the empty air around her. They didn't reach Samantha. They didn't have the power they once had because Samantha had already made her peace with this. She had done what she had to do. She had exposed the lies, the betrayal, the cold manipulation. She had faced down the people who were supposed to protect her, and she had taken back what was rightfully hers. There was nothing left to say. Jason, seated beside their mother, had not spoken. He hadn't moved either. His eyes were trained on the floor, his face a mask of anger and shame. The confrontation earlier had left him drained, and now in the aftermath of everything, he didn't even have the strength to argue. He had always been the one in control, the one who had orchestrated their manipulations, but now he was defeated. He knew it, and the knowledge had hollowed him out. His silence spoke volumes. Samantha's eyes flickered to him for a moment, but she didn't acknowledge him. There was nothing to say to him either. He had already revealed the depths of his treachery. She had no use for his apologies, no need for his words. Samantha felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, and she knew the final judgment was coming. Her mind wasn't focused on the outcome anymore. She wasn't concerned with the verdict. That had been decided long before today. What haunted her, what had gnawed at her during the trial, was the emptiness inside her. The same emptiness she now stood in, staring at the woman who had once been her mother. The tension in the room grew thick again, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for her to speak, to respond. But Samantha didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. Victoria's sobs died down, and she sat there motionless. The sound of her breathing was the only thing that filled the silence. But Samantha wasn't there anymore. She had already walked away. Her heart had closed off her mind, locked away the last remnants of family that had once meant something to her. The love, the care, the trust, they were all gone now. The judge finally spoke, breaking the silence. "I think we've heard enough." His voice was calm, almost detached, as if he had become numb to the spectacle of family tragedy before him. "Jason Shaw and Victoria Shaw, you have been found guilty of all charges. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. I hope you both understand the gravity of what you've done." The words were final, the last blow in the war that had ravaged their family. Jason and Victoria were led away by the officers, their heads down, their hands cuffed, their futures uncertain. And Samantha. She stood there unmoving. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel relief. She only felt the weight of the consequences, the weight of losing everything, her family, her future, the life she thought she'd had. Her lawyer, Michael Green, stepped forward, then placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Samantha," he said softly, but his words didn't reach her. She nodded mechanically, the words he spoke distant and hollow in her ears. For a moment, everything around her felt unreal, like a dream she couldn't wake from. And as she left the courtroom, walking into the harsh light of the world outside, Samantha realized that winning this battle had come at the greatest cost. Her mother had tried to explain, tried to justify her actions, but the truth was clear now. Family was a lie, and she had been nothing more than a pawn in their game. She had exposed their sins, but in the process, she had lost herself. The street outside was bustling with life, people moving, talking, living. But Samantha stood still, watching them pass by, disconnected from the world around her. It was over. The trial, the lies, the family. But nothing had changed. She had won, but all she felt was the absence of everything she had ever known. The months after the trial had been nothing short of a blur. Samantha had left the chaos behind, leaving the city that had once been her home, her sanctuary, to escape the reminders of the betrayal that had torn her life apart. She needed to get away from everything. The memories of her family, the cold walls of the courtroom, the faces of Jason and Victoria as they were led away in handcuffs. It had all felt too heavy, too suffocating. It was time for her to start over. She had chosen a small coastal town far from the life she had once known. It was quiet, peaceful, and most importantly, it offered the anonymity she desperately needed. Samantha didn't want people to know her story. She didn't want to explain, to rehash everything she had gone through. What she wanted more than anything was to feel something again, anything other than the emptiness that had consumed her for so long. She rented a modest apartment in a building that overlooked the ocean. The view was breathtaking. In the early mornings, the sun rose over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the water, and at night the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only thing that filled the silence. For the first time in months, Samantha felt the quiet comfort of being alone without the constant pressure of her past weighing down on her. In the beginning, it wasn't easy. There were days when the memories of her family haunted her, when she would sit by the window staring out at the ocean, feeling a sense of loss that she couldn't shake. The betrayal was still fresh in her mind, the pain too raw to fully heal. But over time, the days became more manageable. The sharp edges of the hurt began to dull, and she realized that she had the chance to rebuild, to reclaim the pieces of herself she had lost. She found work at a local bookstore, a small, cozy place tucked away on a quiet street. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. The bookstore smelled of old paper and coffee, and there was a sense of peace in the simplicity of it all. She didn't need anything extravagant. She just needed to feel like she was part of something again, to have a place where she could disappear into the pages of books and forget the world for a while. The first few weeks were a blur of sorting through shelves, helping customers find books, and learning the rhythm of her new life. She didn't have many friends yet, but the quiet solitude gave her the space to breathe, to think, to heal. Slowly, she started to feel the weight of the past lift bit by bit. The city's fast pace had once suffocated her, but now, here in this small town, she felt the freedom to be herself. There were no expectations, no shadows of the past following her around. It was just her and the open road ahead. One day, as she was shelving some new arrivals in the store, she met a woman named Claire. Claire was in her late 40s, a local artist who had moved to the town years ago to escape the bustling city life. She was warm and kind, with an easy smile and a gentle manner that immediately put Samantha at ease. They struck up a conversation about books, art, and the small-town life, and over time their connection grew. Claire had been through her own share of loss and hardship, and she understood the weight of what Samantha was carrying. She didn't push her to open up, but the quiet understanding between them created a bond. Samantha began to feel the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Claire encouraged her to join the local art scene, to come to gallery openings, to engage with the community. It was a slow process, but it was a start. Samantha found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done in what felt like forever. Slowly, she let her guard down piece by piece until the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. It wasn't just the friends she was making that helped her heal. It was the simple, everyday moments that started to bring her peace. The quiet mornings spent reading by the window, the smell of the ocean air, the sound of her footsteps on the quiet streets as she walked to work. These small things, these seemingly insignificant moments began to fill the emptiness inside her. It was as if the pieces of herself she had lost were being put back together one step at a time. One afternoon, as she walked down the beach, the cool breeze tangling in her hair, Samantha stopped and looked out at the ocean. The waves rolled in relentless and steady, just as they always had. She realized something in that moment. The pain of the past would never fully disappear. It would always be a part of her, a scar that would never fade. But she didn't have to let it control her. She could choose to move forward. She could choose to rebuild her life, to find peace in the midst of the storm. For the first time since the trial, Samantha felt truly free. The weight of her family's betrayal had not disappeared, but it no longer defined her. She had taken the power back, and with that power came a sense of ownership over her own story. She was no longer the victim of her circumstances. She was the creator of her future. Over the next few months, Samantha continued to rebuild her life piece by piece. The bookstore became her second home, and she grew more comfortable with the quiet life she had created for herself. She spent more time with Claire and the small group of friends she had made in the town. She began to rediscover parts of herself she had long buried: her love of reading, her appreciation for art, her joy in simple things. But perhaps the most important change came when Samantha looked in the mirror one evening as she prepared for another quiet night at home, and realized that for the first time in a long while, she didn't recognize the person who had looked back at her at the end of that grueling trial. She didn't recognize the woman who had been broken, shattered by her family's betrayal. The face in the mirror now belonged to someone new, someone stronger, someone who had survived, who had learned to live again. As the weeks turned into months, Samantha's life slowly transformed. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined her. She had found a new rhythm, a new sense of self that had nothing to do with her family, her past, or the trauma that had once consumed her. The pain of losing everything had not gone away, but it had faded like the last remnants of a storm. And in its place there was peace. True, lasting peace. Samantha stood on the beach one evening watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the ocean calm and still. For the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she had taken. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been fast, but she had found her way back to herself. The future was unwritten, but for the first time, Samantha wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She was ready, and that was enough. The evening sky stretched endlessly before Samantha as she stood at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the vast ocean. The last remnants of the day's light painted the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, and the wind tugged at her hair as if urging her to keep moving forward. She stood there watching the waves crash against the rocks below, the rhythmic ebb and flow of the sea soothing the restlessness that still lingered inside her. It had been a year since she left the city, since the trial, since everything that had once been familiar and secure had shattered. She'd built a new life for herself here, far away from the pain, far away from the ghosts of her past. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick. But in this moment, standing alone on this cliff with the world stretching out before her, she realized that the journey had made her stronger than she had ever imagined. The memories of the courtroom, of the confrontation with her mother and brother, still lingered in her mind. The heartbreak of betrayal, the loss of everything she had ever known, would always be a part of her. But the pain no longer defined her. She had faced it head-on, exposed the truth, and emerged from it not unscathed but whole. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, finding peace in the quiet of her new life. And now, with every day that passed, she could feel herself getting stronger, more grounded, more at peace with who she was becoming. The sun dipped lower, casting a soft glow across the water, and Samantha felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with grand expectations or promises of a perfect future. It was a quiet, steady hope, the kind that came from knowing she had survived, knowing she had found her way back to herself. She thought about the life she had left behind, the family that had betrayed her, the pain that had torn her apart. But she had learned something invaluable in the process, that the past didn't have to control her. It didn't have to shape her future. She had the power to create her own path, to move forward on her own terms. The shadows of her past would always be there, but they no longer had the power to pull her back into the darkness. Samantha had found a new rhythm. The small coastal town she now called home had become her sanctuary, the place where she could finally breathe. Her work at the bookstore, though humble, gave her a sense of purpose, a connection to the world around her. She had made friends, formed relationships that were built on trust and mutual respect, something she had never truly experienced with her family. She had rediscovered the joy in the small things, long walks on the beach, quiet evenings reading moments of peace that filled the emptiness inside her with quiet contentment. And yet, as much as she had found peace, there was still something inside her that stirred a longing, a sense that her story was far from finished. The horizon before her was vast, and while she had come so far, there was still so much more to discover, so many more pieces of herself left to uncover. A thought flickered in her mind. Maybe it was time for something new. Maybe it was time to take another step into the unknown. She had spent so much of her life running from the truth, running from the pain, but now she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. She had learned how to face the darkness, and in doing so, she had found her way into the light. Samantha took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs. The wind picked up, tugging at the hem of her jacket, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the world around her. For a long time, she had been afraid of what the future held. But now, standing here, she realized that the future was hers to create. She didn't need to look back anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was hers to walk. She was the one who would choose the direction. As she opened her eyes and looked out at the ocean, she saw the vastness of the world stretching before her. There was something deeply freeing about it. The ocean with its endless horizon reminded her that there was always more to discover. The past was just that, the past. It no longer had a hold on her. She had broken free. Samantha smiled again, this time with a sense of quiet confidence. There were still days when the shadows crept in, when the memories of her family, of what they had done to her, threatened to resurface. But she had learned how to let those moments pass, how to face them without allowing them to consume her. She had learned that healing wasn't a destination but a journey that would continue for as long as she allowed it. With a final glance at the horizon, Samantha turned and began to walk away from the cliff's edge, her footsteps light and steady. She had nothing to prove anymore. She had found peace in the silence and the stillness of her heart. And as she walked, she realized that the future, whatever it held, was something she was ready for. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. The path ahead was open. There were new challenges to face, new dreams to pursue, and new people to meet. And as she walked toward her new life, toward the future that awaited her, Samantha felt a flicker of excitement, a spark of hope that had been missing for far too long. She had overcome the darkness. Now it was time for her to embrace the light. With each step she took, she felt the weight of the past lift even further. She wasn't defined by what had happened to her. She was defined by what she chose to become. And as she walked down the path that led toward her new life, Samantha knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready. She had come so far, and the road ahead, while unknown, was hers to walk. She was finally free. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning,